Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I see the participants list going up, so I'm going to give it a minute for everyone to join. For those of you just joining, welcome. Thank you for attending. I see the number of participants going up, and we're just going to give it about a minute. Welcome everyone. All right, I saw that we had over 100 attendees registered for today's event. So thank you all for joining. I'm just going to give it a little bit more time before we kick off. All right, I'm going to start with some introductory remarks. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Marguerite Harden, and I'm with the Colorado Resiliency Office. And happy June. We have kicked off this webinar series as the first Wednesday of every month. This is part of our Adaptations and Futures webinar series focused on climate. And we have 7 other climate-focused webinars that are already up and recorded on our website. And this is the 8th webinar in that series. And we're excited to have you join us today for a conversation on embedding climate equity in your community. So just a few logistics here that we all are probably getting to know so well. We encourage you to use the chat at any time during the presentation if you'd like to communicate to all attendees and panelists. And you're also welcome to use the Q&A feature in order to ask any questions just to the panelists only. There will be plenty of time at the end of this presentation for question and answer. So feel free to drop them in there at any time, and we'll answer them live at the end or via chat as we go. Also note that just your microphone is on mute, so we do prefer that you type your questions in. Again, feel free to join. We dropped that link into the chat to catch the recording of this webinar and the others in the series on our website. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Lauren McDonnell, who is a climate outreach planner at CDPHE. We're always so glad to work with her, and take it away, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Marguerite. So happy and excited to be here today with our amazing panelists from Fort Collins, Longmont, and Broomfield. I know a lot of our agencies are really interested in the issue of climate equity and how we not only achieve bold and ambitious climate and greenhouse gas reductions, but also make sure that those responses are equitable. So super happy to be here today to have this conversation. We can go on to the next slide. Great, thank you. Actually, yeah, perfect, thanks. So I'm here, as Marguerite said, with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And so I'll just give a brief overview of kind of what the state's doing with our climate equity framework and related work. But really, I want to reserve most of the time to hear from our local partners and then take your questions and answers. So in terms of the intersection of climate and equity, we know that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change across the state. I don't have to tell you all about that, whether it's the hotter, drier summers or the smoke from the wildfires. We also know that climate change is a threat multiplier, meaning it can worsen circumstances for people who are already affected by impacts on their health or social issues or economic or environmental burdens. And we know that any greenhouse gas reduction strategy that doesn't have equity kind of prioritized in front and center has the possibility of worsening those disparities. And so equity and climate action actually really work together and can complement each other, but it has to be super intentional. So that's what we want to share with you today, is a state example and 3 local examples of how that work is being done and all the important work that lies ahead. Next slide, please. At the state level anyway, this work was really kicked off by some groundbreaking legislation in 2019 under House Bill 1261. And it set some really ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals for the state, but it also set out very specific requirements around climate and disproportionately impacted communities. And it requires that the state identify who those communities are and evaluate the potential impacts of any kind of regulations that we're coming up with it to address the climate challenge on those communities, and also make sure that we're soliciting input from communities to help inform climate policy and programs. Next slide. And so the statute includes in the definition of disproportionately impacted communities several groups: people of color, lower income residents, tribes and other indigenous peoples across Colorado, but also people with increased vulnerability to environmental degradation, or maybe what we formerly called environmental justice areas, and those with less opportunity to participate in the policy process. And so that last bullet could be things like extremely remote or rural areas that just aren't able to be a part of the meetings, or linguistically isolated communities that can't participate because of language barriers. And so engaging these communities and encouraging ways for them to influence the policy process is a critical part of climate equity. And in the next slide, I'll just share with you an overview of what's in the climate equity framework. That's really the state's response to this statute. It's a guidance document to help make sure that we're meeting the requirements, but just also really embedding equity into our climate action work. And so it includes some climate equity principles I'll go over with you in a minute. It goes a lot into best practices of community outreach and engagement, particularly with marginalized communities. It goes into a data mapping tool that is helping us identify kind of where we should be prioritizing our efforts across the state, and then some key questions to be asking as we're developing programs and policies to evaluate potential impacts of our regulations on disproportionately impacted communities. And the next slide, did we skip one maybe? No? Okay. So this, there's not one missing? That's okay if not. Okay, interesting. That's okay. I can go ahead and give an overview of the principles. So really the idea of these principles, and they are in the statewide greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap as well. They're really meant to be on the forefront of our minds before we even begin to develop programs and policies to address greenhouse gas reductions. Because as most of us know, you can't get all the way down the road and have your whatever, your rule, your policy, your ordinance, and then say, oh, I wonder how equity comes into play here. Let's check that box and like get some input or reflection or reaction from stakeholders. It's critical that these principles be at the forefront of our minds before we even begin to think about the concepts we're developing, and then go through the stakeholder process very intentionally, allowing it to shape what comes out on the end, and then make sure we have accountability at the end to be able to ensure that the outcomes are as equitable as possible. So these principles, there's 6 of them. We're missing 3, so I'll go ahead and just tell them to you. The first one is equitable representation. And that really is, how do we build a bigger, different table? We have state air quality control commission meetings down at CDPHE in downtown Denver, basically. It could be on a Thursday from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. How does a regular, how do most of us participate in that when we have jobs and families and other responsibilities? And so we really need to be thinking through how to build awareness of stakeholder opportunities, how to go to communities instead of making them come to us, how to partner with organizations that are trusted and locations that are trusted to make sure that we can have frank and honest conversations with communities and get their input in a way that feels safe and meaningful to them, and then make sure that that gets included in what's being developed. The second one is prioritizing benefits. And so wherever the state is coming up with a climate policy or regulation, if there are negative impacts, those need to be minimized for disproportionately impacted communities. And on the flip side, if there's benefits, if there's cost savings or health benefits or quality of life improvements, those need to be prioritized for these communities. And that means they either get them sooner, they get them in a different way, they get them to a greater degree. But that prioritization is key, and it needs to be very intentional and built into the process. The third one is economic impacts. We know that all climate regulations tend to have some sort of a cost and some sort of a cost savings. And so being really intentional about who's bearing the brunt of those costs and who's getting the benefit of the cost savings. So again, prioritizing disproportionately impacted communities when it comes to the economic impacts of our climate response is critical. So now we're to the slide that you're saying. Health impacts, same thing. If there are ways to enhance localized air quality, for example, while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then we should be doing that. Any time that we can build that into a regulation to create health benefits for disproportionately impacted communities, then we should be doing that. And on the flip side, we should be absolutely avoiding any kind of burdens to public health. The fifth one, access to solutions, is really important. Not everyone is going to have rooftop solar and a Tesla in their driveway. That is not the solution for everyone, but everyone can be a part of greenhouse gas reduction strategies. But we have to think in a much more nuanced way about what that looks like. And we have to have community input so that they can help shape what meets their needs, what would actually benefit them, what they'll actually use, what they can afford, all of these factors that go into these really major decisions. But it can't be a one size fits all. And so making sure that we're being mindful of access to clean technologies and solutions is another critical principle. And then finally, building resilience, what this web series is all about, right? We know that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change, and we know that our disproportionately impacted communities are just that. They're feeling those impacts even stronger. And so how do we use climate policy and programs to really invest in resilience for those communities? Next slide. There's the data viewer. Okay, really quick, because I don't want to run out of time here, but to help us identify disproportionately impacted communities across the state. And this is a pretty basic tool, but it's really useful. We created a climate equity data viewer, in part based on EPA's EJ screen and also the Cal EnviroScreen tools. And it really just looks at kind of demographic factors and environmental burden factors to come up with a climate equity score. And what that allows us to do, it doesn't allow us to say this community is or is not a disproportionately impacted community, but it does allow us to rank across the state. So we can kind of see, oh, we really need to prioritize outreach and engagement efforts here. Or, oh, this area has a lot of oil and gas. We need to be really communicating with this area and this community to inform any kind of oil and gas regulation. So it's a really useful tool for that process and those types of decisions. Next slide, please. As far as barriers to engagement, a lot of the climate equity framework focuses on effective community engagement and outreach. And so it tackles things like historical exclusion, who hasn't been at the table and why, and what can we do about it? We know that there's a lack of trust. Government hasn't historically made it easy for community members to participate in the rulemaking process and even excluded them intentionally at times. And we need to be thinking about where are meetings held, when are they held, are they convenient, is it in a safe space that feels comfortable for people? Can I participate in my preferred language? Those types of questions and issues are critical to this. Competing priorities and pressures we all deal with, right? I mean, it just gets to be more and more challenging to get stakeholders to participate in things. And there is something called stakeholder fatigue, where suddenly lots of people want to hear from different communities. and it's getting tiring, and we need to be super respectful and efficient in how we engage. And next slide. Great. And so to help address the need for ongoing and meaningful engagement with DI communities, we're organizing a climate equity community advisory group. And so we're using that data mapping tool that I just showed you to help us hone in on about 12 communities across the state. There'll be representatives from each of them, and they'll meet on a regular basis to weigh in on specific greenhouse gas reduction rulemaking concepts and kind of bring their issues to the table and their priorities that they want to address. And we will be able to compensate them, which is an important best practice, because if you think about it, many people are paid already to be part of the stakeholder process because it's part of their job, whether they're with industry or environmental groups. But it's only appropriate that this lived experience and expertise and skill sets, they're really valuable to this process. And so that compensation is an important best practice. Next slide. Great. And with that, I want to just share with you the link to the climate equity page and my email if you have any questions. We are finalizing the framework. We got a lot of great public comment that we're in the process of making revisions based on. And so that final version will be out a little bit later this summer, and look forward to sharing that with you all. And with that, I want to turn it over to John Phelan. He's the Energy Services Senior Manager for Fort Collins Utilities, and he's going to tell us about some of the wonderful work that they're doing in Fort Collins.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren, for the kind introduction and the framing. Great work all around. And thanks to all of you for committing yet another lunch hour to sharing and learning. I'd like to first acknowledge kind of the paradox of me being a part of this panel. So as a boomer-aged white male, I certainly recognize that I've benefited from my race, my heritage, perhaps in unknowable ways, kind of the silent or quiet side of white privilege. And while I'm really proud to represent Fort Collins today, I can also say that fundamentally what I've learned is that my first and primary role in working within our community is to listen and make sure that I can hear their story. Let's go to the next slide. So what I'm briefly going to summarize today is our approach, our experience, and results from the last 2 years as we revised together at the same time our climate, energy, and waste policies. This was Fort Collins' first planning effort to put people first, to center in equity, and to lead with race. Next slide. So many things were quite different in this process from what we've done in the past. We were not really asking about what should we do, but how should we do it? And by bringing plans together, we're combining processes. We're putting resilience, equity, and mitigation on equal footing. We're making the technical work to be in support of the community's priorities, and ensuring that this is a living plan rather than a periodic sort of extraction of information from the community. Next slide. So our visual to sort of try to illustrate this is on the right-hand side is our kind of our traditional approach, where we started with technical solutions that built up towards goals. And then we tried to sort of connect that with the community through engagement processes, and made attempts as well with our Black, Indigenous, and people of color and our historically underrepresented groups. This time around, we took an extra year basically to turn this around and start with understanding the priorities of our BIPOC and HUG communities, rooted in community priorities, and then developed multipurpose strategies and goals that are in support of those priorities. Not only because it's a more equitable way to work, but we feel it'll ultimately be more successful as we're framing all of these efforts around the things that people care most about, rather than the things that are important to the city as an organization, or capital C. Next slide. So as Laura mentioned, we needed to really understand our historically underrepresented groups. But to go further and really try to dig into how does that historical engagement look like what kind of influence have they had or not had, and then carry that over to the impact side as well, and sort of map out sort of the influence and the impact spectrum. And then understand, how do we prioritize engaging and listening to those parts of our community, and how do we have to change our representation and analysis of the information that we get back. Next slide. So our first efforts happened in 2019, pre-pandemic, and we started with some very basic questions that we were asking about. What does a sustainable Fort Collins look like? And what kind of barriers do you see to reaching that vision? And we did that through our community partners in Plan Ambassadors program, which is a subject all of its own that we can and should talk a lot more about, but we're actually compensating and working with partners who can help us reach and to represent some of those historically underrepresented parts of our community. Pop-up events, simple, fun, reaching people where they're at. And that resulted, next slide, in sort of a community-centered approach, again, by defining what's important to them. I'm going to pop through the next 3 slides really quickly. So let's go to the next one. Because in order to understand, are we reaching those communities, we also had to change some of the information we were asking as we were talking to these groups to get into race and other demographic components that we historically had not asked. And this was one of the areas that we learned a lot in the process about where we can and should be asking these kinds of questions. But we were able to hear from a racial perspective in rough, close proximity to Fort Collins overall demographics. Next slide. Similarly with ethnicity to reaching different groups. Next slide. And also with age, thinking about intergenerational equity. And we're happy to see that we were reaching a better response among younger populations than we generally had before. But again, the point being, we have to change how we understand as we're going through the process and adapt along the way. Next slide. So what came out of this first phase of understanding our community was the set of priorities that were expressions of how our community cares and defines about sustainability. And then it becomes our task to frame our work within these priorities rather than ask the community to adapt to our priorities. One of the other tactics we used was to maintain a level of specific quotes, actual words that aren't edited by anybody throughout the process, all the way through to the final plan that bring that direct experience and lived experience more clearly to life. Next slide. Along came 2020 and a pandemic. And so we obviously, as we entered our strategic and tactical planning, we had to completely change our engagement approach. You see the middle one there, we got really good at doing remote workshops, 302 Zoom workshops. Even Zoom as a platform has inherent barriers. So we also really worked with our community partners and Plan Ambassadors, some different ways of gathering feedback. But we had them all times of day, different languages, different topic areas, again, collected an enormous amount of body of ideas that the community had for how to achieve these outcomes. So what does this look like? Let's go to our next slide. Ultimately, we put together, of course, a planning document called Our Climate Future, adopted by our council in March. While it's a lot longer than we had hoped, we still have maybe some better goals to get to a short document, but it's written in a very community-friendly way. It's about, the plan is about you. It's asking the community to lead. It's using accessible language. We worked really hard to sort of scrub it of all the jargon. We put more imagery in there, explicitly talked about equity, mitigation, and resilience, that nexus. We had some of our community partners and Plan Ambassadors help us edit the document. And they're represented through some of these drawings and quotes. We used the language of big moves and next moves. So let's go to the next slide. Big moves are 13 outcomes that are rooted in those community priorities that were defined in our phase 1. And they cover everything from shared leadership to convenient transportation and how to get around town, waste, renewable electricity, etc. But they're built around people can relate to these kinds of outcomes and language. So next slide. Each one of these big moves has a set of what we call next moves that are the specific tactics. And behind the scenes, this is an example from Healthy Affordable Housing. We worked on this sort of the analysis side, looking at the level of investments, the potential impact on equity mitigation and resilience, and then who's going to be leading and carrying these initiatives forward, where the city should lead and where we're looking for other community partners to lead. Next slide. Just so you're aware of what's in the plan a little bit more. So we did come up with what we called a critical path and then a flexible portfolio. So the 3 critical path strategies were ones that will take sustained funding, sustained commitment, sort of policy commitments across a long period of time to get to our 2030 goals. The remaining next moves become a portfolio that we can adjust and adapt and implement on a continuous cycle over the next several years to get to 2030. So next slide, let's summarize a little bit. I think part of what we've learned, of course, is that climate change is not a math problem, even though we've treated it that way for a long time. And the critical connection of racial, social, and climate justice are linked together. Laura mentioned the trust factor. So we found that we need to either build trust or rebuild trust amongst our community to have these ongoing conversations. And that ultimately what our goal is to establish relationships, because our past efforts have often been extractive. Every few years we go out and ask people about something, and then we go away. And what it needs to be is an ongoing relationship and commitment to that, so that we can have long-term, this is a long journey, we're all learning, and yet we need sort of clear steps where we can show we're making progress. One of the milestones we've created for ourselves is ultimately we would like to have our community members presenting what we are doing and not staff members. So maybe one of the future webinars that we'll have, it won't be somebody from City of Fort Collins staff, but somebody from our community that can speak directly to how our equity efforts are making progress over time. So next slide, and that's just my contact information and link to our website that has more info on our project and process and policies, and look forward to more discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, John. That was wonderful. Next, we want to move to the City of Longmont. We have Francie Jaffe, who is the Water Conservation and Sustainability Specialist for the City of Longmont. And with her is Eric Prieto, who is an Equitable Climate Action Team and Climate Justice Collaborative member, who will be available to answer questions during the Q&A. So Francie, take it away.
Great, thank you, Lauren. As Lauren mentioned, my name is Francie Jaffe. I use she, her pronouns. One component of my job at the City of Longmont is that I coordinate the Equitable Climate Action Team that I'll be focusing on today. Also, as Lauren mentioned, I am joined by Eric Prieto, so I'll be doing the primary presentation, but if you have any questions from his experience as participating, he is here to answer those, since I'm mostly presenting from my experience of coordinating the group. So before I get into that project, I just want to highlight that this is a project that came out of the Longmont Sustainability Plan that centers on environmental stewardship, economic vitality, and social equity. And we've really worked to integrate all 3 of those components into our sustainability program objectives and different opportunities. So even though I'm focusing on the Equitable Climate Action Team effort today, the sustainability plan is just one of many guiding plans for the city that focus on this work, and that the Equitable Climate Action Team is just one of many efforts that worked to integrate climate and equity. Next. So I will be focusing on the Equitable Climate Action Team, or ECAT. Here are some of our members, but I just want to highlight that the ECAT was a part of a larger just transition process, which focused on inclusive engagement, recommendations, and practices for the interconnection of climate action, community health, basic needs, and jobs. Next. So that's further highlighted by this slide that really highlights that the start of this effort was in 2018, but I'm focusing on what's in color, starting with the climate emergency resolution that passed in October of 2019. I'm starting there because for a number of different reasons. One, it adjusted the focus of the ECAT, and I just want to highlight that the group was originally called the Just Transition Plan Committee, or JTP Committee. So you can see their start date there in January of 2020. But I will, for the purposes of trying to reduce confusion, refer to them as the ECAT, or the Equitable Climate Action Team. So this climate emergency resolution created the opportunity to expand the focus of the ECAT from equity and energy, which was their original focus, going to be their original focus, to equity and climate action. The emergency resolution also called for the creation of a city council-led climate action task force that had a limited amount of time to create recommendations for city council on how the city could move towards a more non-carbon community. So that requirement also influenced some of the initial work of the ECAT. Next. So before we even selected members, we were very strategic in how we wanted to engage underserved and underrepresented, as well as frontline community members, to be part of this group. So through previous work we had done during our listening sessions and surveys, we had identified different nonprofits, community partners, cultural brokers who already engage with these members. So even in the recruitment, we were very strategic in our in-person as well as online outreach. Then once we had members, we tried to do different things to make the meetings more accessible. All of our meetings have live interpretation in Spanish and English. They were originally in person, so we had different resources available at that time. And then when we went virtual, we also worked to provide digital access. That's gone to, I would say, mixed. Some members we've been able to provide the support through partnering with our senior center and other partners, while others it hasn't worked as well. And that a lot just has to do with the amount of time and barriers that come up when reaching digital access. Throughout the entire process, we've also worked to provide appreciation gifts. That in itself, I was joking before we came on that that could be a whole 10-minute presentation on how we developed that. But I just want to highlight that our final solution that is working the best for the city is our partnership with the Philanthropies Foundation. They are financially providing honoraria for the city volunteers. Next. So the first thing we did with the group was define equitable climate action. And this took 3 meetings, I think. It took a while because we really wanted to make sure everyone on the group was coming from a place of understanding of what does equity mean, what does climate action mean, to create this joint definition. Next. Go to the next slide, please. Then after that, we worked with a consultant at the time to adapt Government Alliance for Race and Equity, or GARE, and C40 resources into a climate equity discussion guide that we applied to current programs. Actually had a joint meeting. We were able to do this in person with the Climate Action Task Force to review some of their proposed recommendations. And then the group created their own set of recommendations. So the meeting that we were going to have the group create their own set of recommendations was the first meeting we went virtual. So our ideal situation was going to be the group would brainstorm and come up with their own set of recommendations, but because we didn't know how virtual meetings were going to go, instead I went through all their notes and compiled a series of recommendations. This turned out to create a set of recommendations the group ultimately liked, but I would not recommend doing that process, as there's some confusion of like, where did these come from? How are these created? And just probably needed some clarity kind of in that confusion of going virtual for the first time. Next. The final recommendations were included as part of the Climate Action Task Force Climate Action Recommendations Report that was presented to City Council. Myself and as well as Eric and one other ECAT member presented to City Council. We also had the opportunity during the Climate Action Task Force review. We had, the City Council had wanted city staff to do an evaluation and prioritization of using 7 different focus areas, one of which was equity. So the ECAT helped develop those questions. Ideally, we would have had them had a much larger role, but we did not have the time to do that. Lastly, the ECAT recommended that their recommendations be turned into an equity lens that city staff could use moving forward on all climate action programs. And we're still working to figure out how the best way to deliver that to city staff. We do have a document, but are still kind of trying to refine it to make sure it is accessible, because it's a lot of information if you're not familiar to how to do this process. Next. So once we finished, that was kind of the first phase of the group's work, and then moving forward, we really wanted to move towards a more collaborative process of where the group was going. So the first step was renaming. So the group renamed themselves and decided to call themselves the Equitable Climate Action Team, and they also developed a group role. Next. They also developed tasks that they wanted to work on in 2021. The first one was just a lot about building team expectations, and that has also required a lot of internal work, with me working with different city staff, presenting even internally to our city council members to really understand how does this group work, like what is their role. So that has just developing expectations and where we're going with the group. It is a time-consuming process. We also recruited new members, and by the end of June, we should increase to 12 from 8 members. So we're excited for that. Then over the next 2 slides, I'll talk about their other tasks. So 2 of their tasks really focus around how can we encourage accountability, integrate equity in the evaluation of city climate initiatives. So we have the goal of giving feedback on 10 climate action initiatives. You can see a picture of us doing that virtually here. And this is really a mutual learning opportunity. The meetings are really split up, with the first half focused on the staff member explaining. So this was electrification, what that is, and giving the members the opportunity to ask questions. Then we reverse, and then the staff member can then learn from the ECAT members. We've been using their climate equity discussion guide to really ask those questions and get that feedback of how we can make sure equities implement throughout all these programs. So we really try to strive for mutual learning from both staff members and our ECAT members. Next. Something new we're doing this year is exploring community education and outreach. You can see 4 members presenting at our first event about a month ago or 2 months ago. And then we're really exploring what more events the group can do to really try to increase understanding of climate action and equitable climate action. We're exploring presentations, different trainings the group can go through to really help engage more members that are underserved and underrepresented in our community. But I do want to highlight this again has kind of developed this dynamic of how does the ECAT kind of work with our overall city communications planning. So that has also been some internal work that is still ongoing of how we continue to build and foster this relationship. So if you go to the last slide, this is just my email address and a general City of Longmont phone number if there are further questions. I also know there will be more links shared with the resources. Our website's currently down, so I wasn't able to grab those different links. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Francie. Before I go on to our next presenter, I just want to encourage folks to put any questions that you might have for our panelists either in the chat or in the Q&A function. And we'll get to those after our last speaker. Camille Pollan is the Community Sustainability Manager for the City and County of Broomfield. And Camille's going to share her work going on there.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Let's go to the next slide, please. So just to start off with where we are, last year, the City Council set some pretty aggressive goals in sustainability. First of all, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2050, community-wide, and then for municipal buildings by 100% by 2050. We've also set our waste diversion goals to be close to 100% by 2035. So those are ambitious goals. And so the questions are, how do we get there? What is the right mix of policies and programs that will allow us to achieve these goals? And how do we ensure that we are looking at our policy and program development through an equity lens, and including the underserved populations in our planning processes? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so as we look at our engagement process during the planning phase, and I should mention that right now, Broomfield is in the planning phases of our policy and program development. So we don't actually have the roadmap for how we're going to achieve our goals yet. We hope to have those done by the end of the year. And as we reach out to the community and get their input and buy-in, we wanted to look at what are our goals for engagement. We know that we would like to expand awareness and educate the public about sustainability, develop trust and buy-in, identify priority actions for implementation, understand gaps and needs from key constituencies, as well as identifying success stories, because we know they're out there and it's important to highlight them. Next slide, please. So with our engagement structure, what we've decided to do is have engagement on several levels. One is the online focus groups. So we're going to be reaching out to renters, homeowners, and small business owners to identify barriers that can help them adopt sustainability actions. And within each of those meetings, we will have 3 breakout rooms, one to discuss transportation, one on energy, and one on zero waste. And we felt that it was particularly important to have a conversation with renters because they often have quite different considerations from homeowners. Then we are planning on having a broader community outreach series of events, and some of those will be online, and by August we'll have some more in person, again focused on transportation, energy, and waste. And the goal of that second set of meetings is to prioritize potential policy solutions and gather community input as we reach out into the broad spectrum of Broomfield to make sure that we are including all voices. And those meetings will have translation services provided as well. Next slide, please. As we look at who to engage with and how we identify those underserved populations, we started a list of partners that can help us to go out into the community and bring people to the table and ensure that their voices are included. We know that every community has the usual suspects, people that always show up for sustainability meetings, but we wanted to work with our Department of Public Health and our housing department and HHS and diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, as well as senior services. So within Broomfield city and county departments, we have a lot of resources that their clients that they work with every day are struggling with energy affordability and housing affordability. So we wanted to have them help us to tap into those populations, as well as some of the other nonprofits that work in the community, such as Broomfield Fish, which deals with hunger programs, and A Precious Child, and several other organizations such as Energy Resource Center and Energy Outreach Colorado. Next, please. We also looked at data and mapping, and we brought the resources to bear of some of the census information that we've gathered. So this is, you'll see this sort of diagonal line over on the left-hand corner. That's Highway 36, if you're not familiar with Broomfield's geography. But just next to Highway 36 you'll see that there's a large census tract that has some rather old housing, right? So we know that those are inefficient buildings. We know that people are losing energy. So at a household level and on a family level, we know that bringing those families into the dialogue about energy affordability and energy efficiency, for example, that's a really great starting point for us to really engage on bringing these sort of esoteric, larger sustainability issues down to the kitchen table decision-making level. Next, please. We also looked at several other maps that were provided by our health department, and you'll see there's Highway 36 again. And just next to it, there's that red census tract again, where we have high percentage of Hispanic and high percentage of population at 150% below the poverty level. So these data tools are going to give us some means of identifying who we want to reach out to make sure that we are not, again, just inviting the usual suspects, and that we have special efforts that are targeting populations that are underserved and can potentially benefit the most from the programs that we're developing. Next slide, please. We also worked with Colorado Communities for Climate Action. So we're part of this, this statewide network. There's several dozen communities that are members, and Colorado Communities for Climate Action, or CC4CA, embarked upon a process of figuring out how to make sure that equity can be a tool for their members as they embark upon climate planning as well. And what are the ways that we can look at equity as a lens to achieve the outcomes that we desire? Next, please. So first, CC4CA had several subgroups that were kind of working sessions to identify definitions. That was kind of the grounding. So the definition that we started with on equity was when everyone, regardless of who they are or where they're from, has the opportunity to thrive. This requires eliminating barriers like poverty and repairing injustices in systems such as education, health, criminal justice, and transportation. And then, of course, climate justice, the acknowledgement that communities of color and low-income neighborhoods are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. We talked about that at the beginning of this session as well. Next, please. The second goal of the working groups of CC4CA were to develop a framework. Now, CDPHE has a framework, and Lauren mentioned the framework that was provided by the state. This is an excellent tool for communities to use. And so we wanted to distill that further within CC4CA to 5 essential questions. While you're developing policies and programs, you can ask yourself, who is impacted by this action negatively and positively? How can we ensure that the underserved populations benefit from the action and are unburdened by the action? How can we use this action to meet the authentic and culturally appropriate needs of underserved populations and build their capacity? So that second part is important because, as John mentioned before, we want to make sure that not only the leadership at the community, but at the government level and at the these regional levels is representative of the demographics of the state. How can we engage and empower underserved populations in the planning and implementation? And how does this action foster relationship building and trust with community partners? Next. And then CC4CA developed a policy recommendation. This was the third leg of the working group, prioritizing policies that put equity at the center of decision-making by addressing systemic environmental and governance inequities based on race and socioeconomic status, and by justly transitioning and growing the clean economy. Next, please. So for example, your outcome might be every resident, regardless of socioeconomic status, has easy access to a walkable and bikeable neighborhood that includes retail, schools, parks, etc. There are employment opportunities and small business opportunities led by and employing underserved populations and communities of color are involved in the development and implementation of the programs. And I should mention that Portland actually has a fantastic model, and we relied on them a lot as we developed these tools. Next, please. So thank you again. My email address is on there, and I think that we're going to pause here for questions.
Thank you, Camille. So as far as questions, feel free to put some in the chat or in the Q&A function. We'll just start with an easy one. And I know some of the panelists have touched on this, but feel free to elaborate a little bit. In terms of kind of the journey your agency has been on so far, what have been some of the lessons learned? What have been the real challenges that maybe you didn't expect that others could learn from? And what have been some of the success stories that maybe were a pleasant surprise? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in with one that I think I had in my notes to try to weave in, and I wasn't, or I forgot to really weave it in there, which is even more ironic. But it has to do with not only centering in equity, but the concept of leading with race, and specifically how challenging that is. But what I have come to understand through our process is that the value of leading with race is that if the alternative is that you probably won't get there, because race is the most difficult discussion to have around equity, regardless of whether it's individual or in small groups or at the community level. And if we don't sort of start there, then we're probably going to touch on all the other ones that are a little bit easier to talk about, be it socioeconomic or intergenerational. And so that's why we've tried to keep saying we're not only centering in equity, but leading with race, and that critical discussion, while challenging though it may be, means that you'll get to all the other aspects as well. So that's certainly a lesson learned, I think, that we've had, and that most of the time, you come out on the other side just fine, and we've learned a lot more from about ourselves and each other. So.
Thanks, John. Francie or Camille or Eric?
Well, I think there's a number of things, but I think probably one thing I didn't touch on at all was how time consuming it is to effectively engage the community. And also there's sometimes a thought that someone who having expertise in communications and having expertise in community engagement are different things, and that it takes time to effectively engage the community through. And I think even John mentioned this, you have to then come back after the process and continue to follow up, and it can't just be a distractive process. And also being able to explain why is climate equity so important. And I thought John did a great job of explaining that, but really, because I think people focus on the numbers and less on the realizing that we can't meet those numbers if we don't do it all together. And to do it all together, we need to take the time to engage our disproportionately impacted communities. But that can sometimes be difficult for people to fully understand if that's not the experience they are bringing.
Great point.
I think the only thing that I would add was just what I was mentioning during my presentation, which is, there are experts within other departments in your municipal government who are already talking to the populations that you would like to reach, especially within health and human services and public health, and sometimes housing and other areas. So reach out to them and partner with them so that you're really not going at it alone.
Excellent, excellent point. I think I would add in our experience at the state, I think to Francie's point, slowing down. Really, right? It's really easy to just be like, well, here's our timeline and here's when this is due and here's when the statute in our case says it has to be done. But if we really want it to be meaningful and we really want it to engage communities, we have to slow down and take the time to listen and build relationship. And that's a long game, right? And so if that's important to us, I think that's what I've learned is, oh, this isn't going to go on my time frame. I have to adjust and make it a much more collaborative process. I also learned that language services are pretty expensive, but also really crucial. And so just learning that world of setting up interpretation for a meeting or having a document translated and making sure there's resources for that is incredibly important too. What about local communities, local governments who are wanting to get started, but maybe haven't scratched the surface yet? Do any of you have thoughts on maybe what would your first 2 or 3 baby steps be if you don't have a lot of resources or you don't have designated staff to work on this, but it is a priority? Where would you start if you're just going to begin the process?
I'll probably just reiterate what Camille just said. Find those other folks in your organization who are doing this work and who may already be engaged in the community. A lot of this work, when the city's Longmont sustainability plan started, was just one staff member. And a lot of what we've built out, not just this program, but other programs, because she reached out to our community and neighborhood resources team, and they were able to build a partnership and then grow from there. So just wanted to reiterate that point because I thought that was an important thing that Camille mentioned.
I think in recognizing that, all the old habits and existing power structures and decision-making are in place, like it doesn't change overnight. And so how can we build capacity for understanding in this space with our colleagues, our senior management, our leadership, and there's obviously more and more resources and more recognition of this as a critical topic. But we still experienced last minute things happening during council discussions of adoption that glaringly showed who has more power to influence things at the last minute, and just kind of knowing that this is a long journey and sort of at least naming those things when we see them, I think is important as well. So.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, or the question and answer from Matt Scher. This is all around the framework of climate equity and climate justice. Does anyone yet have any data showing the success of these efforts in impacting emissions reductions? It's a great question, Matt. Any local data on that you've seen, either from your own agencies or other agencies who are tracking it?
I'd like to be able to come back and answer that question in a little while, perhaps. So we're very much focused now on trying to improve our results for energy upgrades and retrofits in homes, but in the rental space as a glaringly underserved part of our programs and services. And so the equity focus there, we think is going to actually have tangible results, not only in emissions, but also in health and well-being and lower income and people of color that generally speaking are more proportionally in rental properties. But I don't have the data to back it up yet, but certainly a primary focus of ours right now.
Yeah, I think Francie, did you have something?
Yeah, I also wanted to add that we're still getting started, but there has been a couple of different things that we've seen. One thing I didn't touch on was a survey that we had done earlier, where we targeted households making less than $50,000 per year, which when the survey was done in 2019, that was about a third of Longmont. And out of respondents, 50% could not afford the utility bill. Well, sorry, let me back up. 50% were living in an uncomfortable temperature, could not afford medicine, and could not afford food to afford their utility bill of respondents. So, and then we've also seen, and that that's only of people who respond to the survey, but we were surveying 1/3 of Longmont. So if we want to see our greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings, which is 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions, we need to be able to engage our low-income households, but how can they do upgrades if they can't, if they're already living uncomfortably or living without food or can't afford medicine? So part of our projections into the future, low-income energy efficiency programs is an important component to reaching our objectives.
Thanks, Francie. I know we're at time. I would just add to that, Matt, that the state is in the process of working on a public-facing climate dashboard that will include greenhouse gas reductions in different sectors and areas, but also have some key equity metrics. And so it's difficult to have meaningful metrics, but we're definitely working on it. And so I too would have to say stay tuned at this point for those data. But this has been an incredibly engaging conversation for me. Such an honor to be a part of this panel with John and Francie and Camille. And thank you for being here, Eric. I'll hand it off to Marguerite for some final closing thoughts, but just want to thank you all for your time and being here today.
Thanks, Lauren. And I also want to just express my gratitude to each of these jurisdictions, as well as you, Lauren, for bringing them all together and helping us put on this webinar. And thank you to the communities that were involved in each of these processes across the state. And also thank you to the participants who are still hanging on and listening to this important topic. I do just want to say that our next webinar is on July 7th, that first Wednesday in July, and it will be on efficiency and sustainability in water treatment plants. And you have that link in our chat. So with that, have a wonderful June, and we hope to see you again in July. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.